Greetings, this is a screencast about how to consider the qualitative features of a text complexity analysis. This is a complex process, so we want an example of what it's like to think about some of these different elements. We'll be using this qualitative rubric. I'm using the literature one because I'm going to be looking at a literature text right now. I tried to select a text that most listeners and viewers would be familiar with, so I picked the children's book classic Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. If you're not familiar with that, you might want to pull it up on YouTube real fast and give it a quick viewing to refresh your memory on it. So without further ado, we're going to get started by looking at the text structure. And when I look at that on this rubric, there's two bullets to think about in terms of text structure. One of them is organization, and the other is the use of graphics. So I like to start on one end and kind of work my way across until I find where I think the text belongs. So I start here at slightly complex. Is the organization clear, chronological, and easy to predict? It is chronological in the sense that it goes from start to finish without any flashback or flash forward. I don't know how easy it is to predict because there's a point in the text where Max is given the choice to return home or not, and maybe some kids wouldn't pick up on that because he's having a pretty good time with the wild things. The other thing about the organization is it being clear. There's the points in the text where he uses his imagination, and it seems like a lot of time goes by when he sails out there to where the wild things are and when he sails back. So I would not say that's clear. So I move up here to moderately complex. It says it may have two or more storylines. That isn't relevant here. May be difficult to predict. That sounds a little bit more appropriate, especially because I feel like it's more complex than this. And then just to be sure, I check very complex, and I see the organization may include subplots, time shifts, and more complex characters. I know there's no time shifts. There is not more complex characters. So the organization part at least has me thinking it's moderately complex for text structure. So I jump down to use of graphics. If it's used, which it is, extensively, the illustrations directly support and assist in interpreting the text. It says here they are not necessary to understanding the meaning of the text. I think that they are. So that gets me wondering about going up here, and it says, if used, which they are, a range of illustrations or graphics support selected parts of the text. I think this is a better fit. You know, these obviously don't cover every single part of every single text and what could happen, but I think there's a range in the sense that there's several different images and illustrations, and I think that they do support every text selection, so I think this is a better fit than the slightly. And just to see, I look at vary, and it says if used, they support or extend the meaning of the text. I don't know if I would go quite that far as to extend the meaning. Maybe you could make an argument about that, but since I'm filling this out on my own, I'm going to kind of go with my gut here. And now's a good time to also put out a disclaimer that as you listen to me do this, you might disagree with the way I rate some of these, and that's perfectly okay. And that's a huge reason why we like to cover this topic face-to-face as well as online, is to generate those conversations, because it's really only through that you can have a really deep understanding of how complex a text is and how it could be used. So if you disagree with me, I encourage you to chat about it with someone else. So let's take a look at how I could write that up in my analysis template. So as you can see here, for all of these, I like to put the rating right at the get-go for that particular feature of the qualitative portion. So I put moderately complex here. And then I just kind of put the bullet points of the most succinct things that I thought aloud for you just now, that it's told chronologically, and the graphics and the text support and assist in interpreting the text. If I wanted to go a little bit further, I could maybe provide an example here, such as when Max imagines trees growing in his bedroom to signify that he's using his imagination to visit another place. And then I add here the amount of time that passes during Max's imagined visit to the wild things. The land of the wild things is unclear. So some more evidence from the text to support my claim, and that the illustrations do not explain how long he spends there, or that the forest growing in his room is imagined. So it gives somebody who's maybe not as familiar with this your rationale why, and some guidance indirectly about some things that a teacher might want to focus on if they decide to teach this book. So let's go to language clarity and conventions. So looking at conventionality, it is pretty explicit, pretty literal, straightforward, easy to understand. I look here for moderately complex. It's largely explicit and easy to understand, with some occasions for more complex meaning. I kind of lean towards this because of, like I said before, the use of Max's imagination and in going somewhere else that's not explicitly spelled out that he's doing that, and the reader kind of has to infer that. But the use of language is pretty explicit and pretty clear. So with words like largely and easy to understand, I'm inclined to being in here because something like this would be, even more straightforward. Moving to vocabulary, it is mostly contemporary, familiar conversational language, but not entirely. So I look up here to mostly contemporary, and that I key into that a little bit more. And that it's rarely unfamiliar or overly academic. I think that's a better description to include these, because it does use some words like rumpus and gnash and mischief, which are not conversational terms. And if you look over here for more complex, then you see it's fairly complex language. There's sometimes unfamiliar, archaic, subject-specific, or overly academic, and the book doesn't go there, so I think this is a better fit overall. So right now I'm kind of in between these two for conventionality. I feel really good about this rating for vocabulary. And then I look at sentence structure, and this was really something that surprised me when I did this review. I thought it'd be really straightforward, and then I really looked closely at the sentence structure. The book is, I think, 9 sentences long, and there's a few of them that span several pages of the text, and so it is not mainly simple sentences. I would say it's not even primarily simple and compound sentences with some complex constructions. I would say that even though there aren't that many, that for the most part they are complex with several subordinate phrases or clauses and transition words. So personally, I would actually lean towards putting it here, and this is kind of a great insight. Maybe you're a secondary teacher that wants to use this text to look at complex sentence structure. This could be a great text to look at that lens with. So we're kind of all over the map here. But I could see, with the number of sentences being smaller, somebody might argue for this. And where I look at this holistically, it definitely falls into this category here in the moderately complex. So I'm going to type that up into my analysis sheet now. So again, as you can see here, I just kind of insert some evidence from what I just said aloud into this write-up, that it is largely explicit, and I give an example here about a more complex meaning when the forest grew in his room, and then throw in some of those terms that I mentioned as examples of the more sophisticated vocabulary, and give anybody that wants to use this text a heads up that the structure of the sentences is very complex, and sometimes they span across multiple pages. So that brings us to levels of meaning or purpose. This is another one that I kind of changed my thinking on, and to be totally honest, did some research on my own online because I didn't have somebody to bounce any ideas off of. So this might be one in particular where you want a thinking partner or somebody to think about this with. So is there one level of meaning? Is the theme obvious and revealed early in the text? I'd say not. I think there's more than one level of meaning, because I think there's definitely a level of meaning about the relationship between Max and his mom, and the value of family, and how they're there for each other. But I think there's also levels of meaning about the power of imagination and using that as a way to deal with anger. And then some people, when I read online, talked about the value that Sendak was trying to put across, to be wild and be crazy and go on a wild rumpus. So definitely more than one there, and definitely not revealed early. So this puts me up here to multiple levels of meaning, which fits more with my description or my analysis so far. I don't know how clearly distinguished they are from each other. It's clear, but it may be conveyed with some subtlety. I do like that word subtlety with this rating, because I think that Sendak is not really explicit with it at the same time. And then I look over here to very complex, and the multiple levels of meaning that may be difficult to identify or separate. The theme is implicit or subtle and may be revealed over the entirety of the text. I can see how somebody might make that argument for this text, but I feel like with the word subtlety here and the multiple levels here, this is a better fit. So I'm going to categorize it as. So as you can see, again, I included some parts from some references to the text to justify my rating of moderately complex for levels of meaning. I mentioned family and anchor, imagination. I decided to leave out the thing about the value of being wild and crazy, but I feel like overall it justifies why it should be moderately complex. And finally, that brings us to the knowledge demands. What are the life experiences? Does it explore a single theme portrayed? The experiences are portrayed are everyday and common to most readers. It's interesting how the theme kind of relates to the meaning. So we know there's more than one, but when I look at the experiences, I think that for the most part they are everyday, at least for the beginning and end in terms of Max being sent to his room and having a conflict with his mother. It's certainly not universal, but certainly common. And then the intertextuality and cultural knowledge, no references or allusions to other texts. And this is something that stood out to me. There is really nothing referring to outside allusions or cultural elements. So it kind of leans me towards rating it down here in slightly complex. As I look here, there's a few references or allusions, which there are not. And then I look here that explores several themes, and the experiences portrayed are common to many readers. So I could maybe, based on this, score it higher. But I feel like when I think about this, I think a lot about background knowledge, and I don't feel like students would need a ton of preparation to read a text like this in outside research. So I'm gonna rate this one as slightly complex. So as you can see here, I wrote that up as slightly complex and mentioned that the experiences are common, so kind of acknowledging that it could be moderately complex, but with the lack of references or allusions to outside text or cultural experiences, it's kind of why I feel like it belongs where it does. So I hope this screencast was helpful, and I hope you find some other people to run your thinking by, because I think that's a real value in this process. Have a great day or evening.